Welcome back to the History Informer. Today I will be talking about a series of politically motivated bombings that rocked the nation just over 100 years ago and culminated into the deadliest bombing in New York City until the 9/11 attacks 81 years later. Like all videos, this video will be available first on Patreon a week before dropping onto YouTube. Now on to the video. Recently, the increase in politically motivated violence in the United States over the past 2 years is not a new phenomenon, unfortunately. Just over a century ago, the United States was shaken by a series of bombings that have never truly been solved. Before we discuss the bombings themselves, let's go over the circumstances that led to the bombings. During the late 19th century, new political movements were spreading throughout the United States. Anarchism was one of these movements, and the reason behind this movement was a response to the increasing wealth gap in the United States. Anarchists believe that many of the problems facing the lower classes in the United States were caused by wealthy corporations and the government. These problems were limiting the freedom of individuals. Anarchism gained traction in the United States during the late 1800s as labor unions began to organize. Believers of anarchism found support in the growing labor movement due to labor unions and anarchists both struggling against what they perceived as the coercive power of governments and large corporations. Support for anarchists in labor unions increased after several large-scale strikes were put down violently by corporate thugs or government soldiers. In the face of such repeated failures, belief that the change in the status quo could be attained by the political process declined, with a rise in support for increasingly extremist and violent actions. Extremists believed that change would only happen after a violent overthrow of the current political and economic system. Anarchism found a receptive audience in many immigrant communities across the country, with the ideas of Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman becoming prominent. The writings of these two individuals reflected many of the challenges faced by immigrants in the United States, and the reason why these immigrant communities were receptive to the ideology of anarchism was because of the challenge they faced in an America that was dominated by nativists at the time. With the reforms that took place in the United States during the Progressive Era, support for extremist groups declined. During the Progressive Era, labor unions won a series of victories that improved the working conditions for many American workers. Unfortunately, many of the reforms that were passed during the Progressive Era were repealed during World War I, with the United States government executing a series of actions that inflamed tensions in the country. The two most infamous laws that were passed during this time were the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. The purpose of these two acts were to silence criticism of the American war effort and were later used against many anarchists who as a group were very vocally and politically opposed to the growth of government power during the war. The government used the Espionage and Sedition Act to suppress criticism of American conduct of the war, and the enforcement of these acts erased many of the gains won by labor unions during the previous decade, which included limited work days and better working conditions. The infamous anarchist Luigi Galliani was one of the more vocal opponents of American policies during the First World War. Because of this fear of suspicion in the United States, the immediate post-war period was set up for the stage of upheaval experienced in 1919 and 1920. Radical writers like Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman supported the idea that governments and laws must be done away with for the benefit of humanity. The Wartime Espionage and Sedition Acts were used to censor opinions of radical writers, and due to this, the propaganda of the deed rose to prominence in the anarchist community. The propaganda of the deed is supposed to be a catalyst of revolution and change. Many see the anarchist bombings of 1919 and 1920 as examples of propaganda of the deed. The anarchist bombings of 1919 occurred during the first Red Scare. In the first Red Scare, there was a fear of Bolsheviks overthrowing the United States government. These bombs were sent through the United States Postal Service. 28 of the bombs were intercepted before reaching their intended targets. 2 more bombs did reach their intended targets with different outcomes. 1 bomb was sent to the mayor of Seattle, but the bomb failed to explode when the package was opened. The second bomb, however, did explode when it arrived at the office of a Georgia senator and injured a nearby maid. On June 2, 1919, 9 more bombing attacks were carried out across the United States simultaneously against prominent Americans, including Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, Judge Albert Hayden of Boston, Massachusetts, amongst others. Because each of these bombs on the June 2nd bombing were delivered by hand, simultaneously, investigators concluded that the bombings were sponsored by an organization of violent extremists. At one of the bomb sites, which was Attorney General Mitchell Palmer's house, human remains were discovered amongst the records, and a nearby flyer containing a manifesto of a group calling themselves the Anarchist Flyers was recovered. It is believed that the group called themselves the Anarchist Fighters were originated from the Gallianists, who were followers of Luigi Galliani. Luigi Galliani was deported from the United States back to Italy earlier in 1919 and called for his followers to strike back against the government for doing this. Further evidence pointed towards Italian anarchists of the attack as the attackers. One of the judges that was targeted in the bombing was Charles C. Knott, who presided over the trial of 2 suspected Italian anarchists. Here's a message found on the flyers that were discovered at each of the bombing sites. The powers that may be no secret of their wealth to stop here. In America, the world-wide spread of revolution. The powers that must be reckoned that they will have to accept the fight they have provoked. We have been dreaming of freedom. We have talked of liberty. We have inspired to a better world, and you failed. You clubbed the deported, murdered us wherever you could. The jails, the dungeons you reared to bury all protesting voices, and our planners with languishing, contentious workers, and never satisfied, you increase their numbers every day. It is the history of yesterday that your gunmen are shooting and murdering unarmed masses, wholesale. It has been the history of every day in your regime. And now all prospects are even worse. Do not expect us to sit down and pray, try. We accept your challenge to meet the stick to our war duties. Do not say we are acting cowardly because we keep in hiding. Do not say that it is abominable. It is war, class war, and you are the first to wage it. We are not many, perhaps more than a dream of thought, but are all determined to fight to the last, till a man remains buried in your Bastille's, till a hostage of the working class is left to the tortures of your police system, and will never rest till your call is complete, and the laboring masses in taken possession of all that is rightly belongs to them. There will be more bloodshed. There will have to be murder. We will kill because it is necessary. There will have to be destruction. We'll destroy to rid the world of your tyrannical institutions. What has been done by us for so is only a warning that there is friends of popular liberty still living. Only now we're getting into the fight, and you will have to change to see what liberty-loving people can do. Besides, you will never get all of us. We are multiple nowadays. Just wait and resign to your fate, since privilege and riches have turned their heads. Long live the social revolution, down with the tyranny. The anarchist fighters. Please note that the grammar and the wording of this phrase is exactly what was listed on the flyers. In the aftermath of the bombings, Attorney General Palmer called for Congress to pass funding for the Department of Justice to launch an investigation into radical groups and discover who was behind the attacks. To investigate these radical groups, the Justice Department created the Anti-Radical General Intelligence Division that was headed by the future director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. In what has now become known as the Palmer Raids, started in November of 1919 and resulted in the arrest of hundreds of people, with more than 200 of those individuals being deported to the Soviet Union. Among the hundreds deported was the notable anarchist writers Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. Many of the individuals who were deported to the Soviet Union had lived in the United States their entire lives and were native-born Americans. In total, 5,000 people were arrested, with the majority later being released based on lack of evidence for the charges that they were facing. Despite all this effort, the Justice Department was unable to prevent the 1920 Wall Street bombing. On Thursday, September 16th, 1920, the deadliest terrorist attack in the history of New York City until 9/11, 81 years later, occurred. An unknown individual parked a horse-drawn cart filled with explosives and metal objects in front of the J.P. Morgan building on Wall Street. The explosion occurred at noon, with hundreds of people filling the streets. 40 people were killed and hundreds others were injured by metal fragments. Efforts to gather evidence was hampered by the destruction of the site by cleaning crews commissioned by members of the New York Stock Exchange. Anarchist literature was also discovered nearby the bomb site that shared a similar message to the manifestos written by the bombers in 1919. Despite the efforts of the Department of Justice and the New York Police Department, the perpetrators of the Wall Street bombing have never been identified, and the case remains unsolved to this day, with the last active investigation into the bombing closing in 1944. It has been speculated that the driver of the horse cart might have been killed in the blast, as there were 3 bodies amongst the 40 killed who were never identified due to the extent of their injuries. This bombing, instead of marking the beginning of an anarchist revolution in the United States, was instead the high watermark of anarchism in the United States. Following the bombing, the government began to crack down on anarchist groups, and the power and influence of these organizations began to fade and had completely disappeared by the 1930s. Thank you again for watching this video. Please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, and also subscribe to my Patreon channel to help support me. Thank you again, and I'll join you next time on The History Informer.